So this is what the city agrees to.
In full.
What happens if they don't do these things? I mean, what really happens?
A federal judge monitors compliance. If they fail to make the promised goals or the reforms don't happen, he can hold the whole city in contempt.
And then what?
This video is sponsored by Adam and Eve, offering half off and free shipping for one item. Hang around to the end of this video to watch me have a little bit of fun. This is We Own This City, the 2022 show from journalist turned screenwriter David Simon and former detective Ed Burns. David Simon is kind of seen as a guru in progressive and liberal circles when it comes to the police. He covered the police for the Baltimore Sun for 12 years before taking those lessons he learned about policing and turning them into TV. First in Homicide: Life on the Street, then The Corner, and then this little show called The Wire. Maybe you've heard of it.
When you walk through the garden.
The Wire is largely considered one of the greatest TV shows ever made, chronicling the war on drugs in Baltimore in extremely nuanced detail, dissecting it from the perspectives of the police, the dealers, the local politicians, the education system, and even the media. The Wire's really good. You should check it out. I'm sure nobody's ever told you that before. Certainly not me. Not me in another video. That wasn't me, officer. That guy had hair. Simon's commentary on the war on drugs in The Wire isn't just revered by TV critics and nerds on Twitter. Then President Barack Obama invited Simon to the White House to tell him how smart and great he thought the show was.
At the front end, I got to tell you, I'm a huge fan of The Wire. I think it's one of the greatest, not just television shows, but pieces of art in the last couple of decades. I was a huge fan of it.
So you can imagine the anticipation when Simon returned to the streets of Baltimore 20 years later with his new show, We Own This City, which tells the true story of Wayne Jenkins and his corrupt gun trace task force, which robbed people, committed horrific acts of brutality, and sold drugs that they stole from dealers. At the same time, the show also covers the attempt to reform the Baltimore Police Department in the wake of Freddie Gray's murder. I mean, very unfortunate death while in the caring hands of the police, legally speaking.
I dated to the day of Freddie Gray's funeral.
Funeral and the rioting that followed.
The uprising.
Uprising, pardon me.
Where The Wire was fiction and told a sprawling story examining every aspect of the organism that is the city of Baltimore, We Own the City is a tight, nonfiction story and asks just one question. It's a simple question, but one without a simple answer. What does police reform look like? Welcome to Copaganda, a series of videos exploring the portrayal of the police on television and how that portrayal has shaped our understanding of who the police are and what they should be. We've covered how the LAPD helped start the cop show genre by providing creative input and censorship on Dragnet, before breaking down Blue Bloods, Brooklyn Nine-Nine twice, The Wire, The Shield, Marvel Superheroes, Lucifer, Spooky Cop Shows TM, Paw Patrol, and even Top Gun Maverick. And today, we're headed back to Baltimore. We Own the City depicts a lot of issues we've talked about in this video series already. It shows how insanely easy it is for plainclothes police units to become corrupted. It goes a long way in trying to dispel myths about the police, showing Wayne Jenkins and his cronies committing disgusting acts of violence in a way that assures the audience that these are not just one-off bad apples. But I've covered a lot of those ideas in other videos, namely my videos on The Shield, a show that is remarkably similar despite being based on historical events from the 1990s instead of the 2010s.
Doesn't bother you the things he does?
I don't judge other cops.
Mackey's not a cop. He's Al Capone with a badge.
These officers, I have no sympathy for them. They are like 1930s gangsters, as far as I'm concerned.
Weird how rampant police corruption just keeps happening. I'm probably just imagining things. Chalk it up to deja vu. But I want to talk about We Own the City because it is the most complete picture of police reform I've ever seen attempted on TV. It doesn't just say, hey, let's try reform, and that's the end of the story. It actually shows the mechanics of what goes into that process, which is something that we frankly never see on screen. It's just not that sexy. But between my analysis and David Simon's writing and John Bernthal's weird little Amish beard thing he's got going on, we're gonna make it sexy, okay? I will make you care. Like Like I mentioned earlier, We Own the City divides its story into two pieces. The investigation that leads to the demise of Wayne Jenkins and the Gun Trace Task Force, and the Federal Department of Justice investigation brought into Baltimore in response to civil rights violations. We will get to the Wayne Jenkins of it all, but I want to start with the DOJ, because this is exactly the kind of thing that I think police reformists want to see. The federal government coming in and providing some kind of oversight and accountability to city police departments. Nicole Steele is the face of this storyline, an attorney put in charge of drafting what's called a consent decree. We hear this term thrown around all the time on the show. It's like seeing meth in Breaking Bad or sexualized children in Euphoria's writer's room.
So this will be your first consent decree. Consent decree. Consent decree. Consent decree.
Consent decree.
Consent decree.
Consent decree. Consent decree.
Oof. Mommy, talk dirty to me. Who said police reform isn't sexy? Consent is definitely sexy. But like, what is a consent decree?
A consent decree is not a magic pill. It is, however, a court-ordered and enforced mandate that will compel us to make necessary improvements to processes that have long been neglected. At times, it will introduce changes to our organization that may cause anxiety. Police, after all, do not adjust well to change.
Long story short, a consent decree is a federal and legally binding court order that demands a number of changes and reforms be made in a police department, and puts that department under heightened scrutiny until a federal judge is satisfied with the results and dismisses the decree. Sexy stuff, am I right? It's like that scene in 50 Shades of Grey. You know the one with the contract negotiation.
Turn to page 5, Appendix 3, soft limits.
With you.
Find anal fisting.
I'm all ears.
Strike it out.
Consent decrees are actually the most powerful tool for police reform ever created in the United States, replacing an old system of commissions that would create committees to appoint a task force to investigate and present findings to a panel, and, hopefully that whole process just took long enough that you forgot what you were mad about in the first place. Believe it or not, consent decrees actually came from the 1994 crime bill, which is a bit like finding a delicious crouton in your bowl of razor blade soup.
So the Department of Justice was supposed to put teeth into consent decrees. They chose like a terrible name. Like, of all the things that don't make sense, like a consent decree, it just is like not sexy at all. Like, nobody knows or cares what that is. But in fact, it's the most important police reform tool that has ever been created.
That's Tim Tolka, the author of Blue Mafia, Police Brutality and Consent Decrees in Ohio. As someone who has studied and written a bit about consent decrees, I asked him to help me understand how a consent decree comes to pass.
It has to come out. So the press often causes this, and it's got to be like a cluster of like civil rights lawsuits, bad press, and viral videos.
Yeah.
That's what usually will cause an inquiry from the Department of Justice. Once Department of Justice investigators show up, they do an investigation, and then they do their report, and if they find probable cause that there's a pattern or practice of police misconduct, that's when they sue the department in the local district federal court, and they can come to either a consent decree or a memorandum of understanding. It kind of...
That sounds even less sexy.
Like, it depends on who's in office. Oh, very much. All of it is decidedly unsexy.
No, it's very sexy. Keep paying attention. Just imagine the consent decree is written with like Alexander Skarsgård's pec sweat or something. I don't know. And We Own the City does an excellent job of laying out how such a monumental step became necessary in Baltimore.
In fact, I got to Baltimore before Freddie Gray, with an independent consulting team that was requested by the mayor after the newspaper here revealed a shit ton of city payouts to brutality victims. So that was voluntary. But after Freddie Gray, the mayor went all in, asked DOJ for a full-bore investigation to support a consent decree. But the truth is, she didn't have to ask. After Freddie Gray, we were coming whether she asked or not.
Consent decrees have been implemented in a number of cities across the United States, perhaps most notably in 2001 Los Angeles. This was in response to the Rampart scandal, where, and stop me if you've heard this one before, a plainclothes gang unit was revealed to be doing things like unprovoked shootings, beatings, planting false evidence, and stealing drugs to sell them on the street for themselves. And you know what? Now that I'm hearing it back, that does sound familiar. I actually covered this scandal in my video on The Shield, because that show was based off of it. It's all part of the SICU, the Skip Intro Cinematic Universe. Anyways, this LA consent decree is considered one of the bigger successes in the history of the tool's implementation. When the decree was finally lifted, the executive director of the ACLU of Southern California stated that, quote, "This is no longer your father's Los Angeles Police Department. The LAPD has made serious culture changes." Hooray! Oh, wait, I'm seeing that the LAPD killed 3 men of color in the first 3 days of 2023. Keenan Anderson, Oscar Sanchez, and Takar Smith. The latter 2 were shot during mental health crises, and Anderson was killed by a police elbow to the neck during a traffic stop. Certainly sounds like your father's LAPD. Although, I guess your father's LAPD didn't kill Rodney King, so... Culture changes. You may be wondering when that consent decree was considered successful. Well, it wasn't lifted until 2013, after 12 years of scrutiny. Originally, it was supposed to be lifted in 2006, but the judge in charge, Gary Fease, extended it, scoffing at the idea that the LAPD wouldn't backslide, saying, quote, "You mean we've got such a history of compliance to reform by the department that we should trust that backsliding won't happen? That is contrary to the last 40 years of history of this department." The Honorable Gary Fease, everyone. Just spitting out here. But this kind of start and stop is par for the course with consent decrees, and is the first of 4 big major challenges that cities who implement consent decrees face. They can take a really long time to produce even modest results. Seattle has been under a consent decree since 2012 that was set to expire in 2020, until the city saw the police department's response to the protests and decided, maybe we should do some more work on this. Albuquerque entered into a 4-year consent decree in 2014, and today has yet to reach full compliance. Portland has operated under one since 2014, New Orleans since 2012, and Oakland's consent decree just ended last year after 2 decades. In Ferguson, Missouri, where the DOJ found a systemic exploitation of Black people by law enforcement, the people working on the consent decree were still just developing policy 4 years after Michael Brown was killed, not even close to implementation.
Have those specific policies and practices identified the DOJ, have those stopped under the consent decree?
At least one of the things that stood out to me, there were many things, the police sticking dogs on people and biting their citizens. But one of the big things with the statute that will stand out is there were more warrants than people in the city.
That's exactly
Now, they dismissed a whole bunch of the warrants, but still, on any given night, the line is still wrapped around the building and it's full of Black people. But the process has been so slow on the ground in Ferguson, they still haven't implemented policy yet. So there's still no policy phase. Nothing has changed.
So they're just developing new policies under the consent decree.
Developing.
And this leads directly to another challenge consent decree cities face: money. The reforms called for in consent decrees, like increased and improved training and equipment like body cameras, cost cities lots of money, on top of having to pay the federal monitors who watch them. Los Angeles was estimated to have paid $10 million annually during their consent decree, and the considerably smaller city of Albuquerque spent $8.5 million in 2019. And in this regard, We Own This City paints an incredibly vivid and accurate picture of the conversation these budgets force out of decision makers.
What they're asking for isn't going to be possible without additional budgeting. The cost of upgrading the video technology alone is, John's run the numbers.
I was conservative, but looking at only what we've agreed to here.
If you look at the overall fiscal budget, this can only come from schools, rec centers, and after-school programs.
Those are my babies. It can't come from my babies.
That money has to come from somewhere, and surprise, surprise, those cuts are often expected to come out of social programs that could be reducing crime, like education, rec centers, and after-school programs, but, never from things like police overtime.
You cut overtime, patrol cars go empty.
Then find somewhere else to cut.
Your Honor, we're going to hit 340 murders again this year. Crime is up in every category, and I have officers who won't go out on the street to police because of the Freddie Gray case. That is the reality I'm dealing with here.
It's hard to listen to the police commissioner plead poverty when we just paid out a $6.5 million settlement to the Gray family. How many new body cameras would that money have paid for?
I say if you can't get the job done 8 to 4, just stop. We Own This City is really good at giving this conversation multiple perspectives, giving shape to the kinds of conflicts that complicate decision-making. From the civilian side, it feels a bit like paying for protection from the mob. You pay the police a ton of money, and then you pay them even more money when they mess up and do a bad job. From the perspective of the police commissioner, it's very hard to make the big sweeping changes that are being asked without financial support, especially when police officers themselves are so hostile to change.
I mean, you got the bosses that going along with this consent decree, soft-ass fucking baby boy bullshit. I mean, how am I supposed to police like this anyway?
What happens after the consent decree gets signed is that generally half of the officers just quit. But Baltimore citizens were coming up against a really typical impediment. The police would be either brutal or just not work. And so crime was spiraling out of control, which upsets the citizens. But then you lose your reformist energy and the political will to change when the cops just kind of, because the only way we can enforce the law is with proactive policing, which means heavy-handed, typical, like the stuff that we saw in viral videos from like 1992 until today.
And again, we see this depicted accurately all over We Own the City. The show opens with Nicole Steele observing a number of police officers giving up on an arrest when confronted with citizens who start recording them with their phones.
They just quit the arrest. Cameras pointing at them in every direction, and they just cut and ran. Left that man on the pavement just like that.
Well, that makes a statement.
Sure does. Says that after Freddie Gray, if we have to police the right way, we're not going to police at all.
Later in the series, she confronts the head of the Fraternal Order of Police, who claims that there is no work slowdown, because, he's a super objective source on this topic.
Are Baltimore police engaged in a work slowdown because of the Freddie Gray indictments?
The union does not in any way endorse a job action. But if you're asking if there are officers who won't risk indictment for trying to clear a corner or make an arrest, I think that's probably the case.
Now is a good time to remind you that most organizers don't consider police unions to be the same as labor unions, and for one main reason. Labor unions organize in opposition to capital and the ruling class, while the police are the tools of capital and the ruling class. Protecting property rights and enforcing laws are not inherently bad things, depending on who you ask, but property is disproportionately held by those with wealth, and those same people are the ones who wield the political power to write laws. The police are the fist of the state, as opposed to the working class. And that's me just throwing that in there for the 3 people who keep commenting on all my propaganda videos about that. I've served you. And the fourth challenge that consent decree cities face is also pointed out in We Own This City: administration change.
I saw enough there that I asked if there were openings in the civil rights office, and so here I am.
You better hope that Hillary wins.
What do you mean?
She means if the election goes the wrong way, you won't have any work to do for 4 years. In any Republican administration, the OCR is where good lawyers come to die.
Oh, there's no way Trump even gets a nomination. No way he can win.
Anyway, welcome to the team.
And yeah, when the Trump administration was sworn into office, Attorney General Jeff Sessions expanded private prisons, and one of his final acts in office was to make it harder for the Justice Department to issue and enforce consent decrees.
Sessions expanded the use of private prisons. He called for harsher punishments for minor crimes. And when he was pushed out of office, his final act was to limit consent decrees, hamstringing the power of the federal government to force cities like Ferguson to reform its courts and police.
When consent decrees can linger on, they're incredibly likely to see administration change. And when conservatives take office, they tend to roll back a lot of police reform efforts in the name of law and order.
If it's a Republican administration, there's not going to be any consent decrees.
Okay.
And if there are consent decrees, they'll try to shut it down. But they'll do memorandums of understanding where the police union basically gets together with the police unions. They get together with local activist groups and are like, yeah, we're gonna stop beating your people or something. The Trump administration came in, and everybody who studied police misconduct and reform knew that Sessions was going to hamstring the Civil Rights Division.
Still, consent decrees are just the sexiest little piece of police reform the American government has ever created, even if they fall flat. It's kind of like wearing a dress that shows your ankles in the 1800s. Yeah, it's really sexy given the other options, but I don't know, it's not doing it for me. Not to kink shame, I'm just more of a knee guy. They like the kneecaps. Kneecaps and also the back of the knees. The real issue that consent decrees run into is that they're asking the police to fix themselves, and well, I'm not sure they're really all that trustworthy.
Now, when you need to get 12 people together to make a jury, 12 people to believe that you aren't lying on the witness stand about who shot Tater or who robbed the Rite Aid, they look at you and remember when some other cop lied on them or their son or brother. The lawyers will tell you we lost the city juries doing this stuff. They think police just lie.
Because now you do.
Now we do.
One of the main missions of We Own the City is to point out how damaging it is for the criminal justice system to function without public trust in the police. When the police abuse their power and avoid accountability by lying, it's pretty hard to trust them or to get a jury that isn't instinctively resistant.
From that experience, you feel you could not credit the testimony of the police officers in this case?
From that experience, I wouldn't believe a Baltimore officer who testified that his mother loved him.
Because of that experience, you are sure you could not be an impartial judge of the evidence in this case?
Is the evidence coming from Baltimore police? Because if that's the case, I know he ain't gonna have no problem lying.
Are there any other jurors who have had prior experiences that would cause them to disregard the testimony of police officers?
To its credit, We Own the City is probably the only show I've ever seen that spotlights police officers committing perjury to cover up their misconduct, and that the court system is aware of that fact and simply has to work around it.
You should get a copy of the list.
The list?
Yes, there is a list of about 24 Baltimore police officers who can no longer testify in court because they have been exposed for on-the-stand perjury.
That many?
And more being added all the time.
And Herschel's on this list.
Not yet, but he should be.
But I also think that We Own the City makes this seem a little more anomalous than it really is. As it turns out, police officers lie all the time in sworn testimony. In fact, it's so rampant that there's a term for it, test-a-lying. There's the example of Christopher Parham, a black 19-year-old who was tased by the NYPD. Officers claimed he resisted arrest, but surveillance footage showed that the NYPD's account was false. They just lied about it. The district attorney dropped charges against Parham, but the officer was never disciplined, despite having a list of abuse complaints filed against him dating back to 2012. Or take the story of Kimberly Thomas, a black woman whose apartment was illegally searched by the NYPD. The officer claimed he had kicked her laundry bag and felt something hard, which is how he found a gun, and then they searched her apartment. But there was surveillance footage. There wasn't even a laundry bag. They just barged into her apartment. Frankly, life for a police officer is a lot easier if they just lie. They get to obtain evidence without having to deal with that pesky Fourth Amendment.
That right there is a drug deal.
It's 11:30 in the morning, man. How the fuck do you get there?
Come on, man. Fucking make a car, a backpack he's wearing. Baltimore, it's all the PC we need.
They can justify disproportionate use of force.
Oh, you see that? He put his hands on me. He touched me. Turn around. I said turn the fuck around.
Arrests that lead to convictions, wrongful or not, lead to promotions. And in a lot of circumstances, it doesn't even matter if these arrests hold up in court. Officers can pump up arrest stats while overflowing the court docket and reap the rewards.
There's only two ways to add to your city scale salary, my son. First is overtime. Nobody's gonna approve overtime for chasing 911 calls or making street arrests from patrol. Second is court pay. You make enough arrests, you not only get credit for the stats, you can overfill the day's docket and get paid twice.
We Own the City shows how exactly this kind of thing got Wayne Jenkins promoted to the head of the Gun Trace Task Force. He put up good arrest numbers by breaking the rules through harassment, illegal searches and seizures, and planting evidence. And regardless of whether the charges stuck or not, he put guns on the table. He put up good stats for his bosses.
Now, we are the Gun Trace Task Force. We get guns off the streets. What we do. Now, with a little more personnel, a lot more overtime, there's no telling the effect that we could have reducing the surge of violence in this city.
And the lying, well, that was taught to him by his superiors in order to keep him on the streets producing those same stats.
You're an earner and you work your ass off. We are always going to protect you. But seriously, you could have been nailed.
See, it has to seem standard to anyone looking at this that you and any other officers were in serious danger.
I know.
I don't even see the part in here about the broken bottle. I hear about that from your partner.
Yeah, look, that fucker, he didn't just drop it. I mean, yeah, he did. He threw it right at me.
But it's not just the Wayne Jenkinses of the world. Because of the way prosecutors rely on the police to do their jobs, they're unlikely to ever challenge lies or to investigate them when presented with clear evidence. Instead, they create lists like the one mentioned in We Own This City, shadow banning those officers, but still keeping them on the street doing whatever the fuck they want.
We go get those guns, you understand? Because as long as we do that, as long as we produce, as long as we put those numbers up, they don't fucking give a shit about what we do. We literally can do whatever the fuck we want, you understand me? We own this city.
As Mark Joseph Stern lays it out for Slate, quote, "As long as officers' lies cannot be proved false, prosecutors have little reason to question their account of events. As a New York assistant district attorney told the Mullen Commission, taking money is considered dirty, but perjury for the sake of an arrest is accepted. It's become more casual." This rampant lying isn't a bug in the criminal justice system. It's actually essential to its function in the United States.
Kid, there's no dictatorship in America more solid than a beat cop on his post.
As Bennett Capers, a former federal prosecutor and Fordham law professor who studies police lies, told Stern, quote, "In all honesty, I think my initial reaction would be that the system cannot exist without it. It would grind to a halt. Run-of-the-mill policing would have to change. We are doing about 13 million misdemeanor arrests a year. With a lot of those small crimes, there's fudging. Nobody's paying attention." An investigation by the New York Times found 25 occasions between January 2015 and March 2018 where, quote, "Judges or prosecutors determined that a key aspect of a New York City police officer's testimony was probably untrue." The Times identified these cases, many of which are sealed, through interviews with lawyers, police officers, and current and former judges. Sealed, not prosecuted. Isn't perjury supposed to be illegal? What's up with that? Like, it's only crime if someone else does it. If the police do it, it's just, you know, they're the good guys. Wayne Jenkins got so much crime off the street, unless you count all the crimes that he did. And these are just confirmed ones on cases that went to trial, to say nothing of the roughly 95% of criminal cases that are resolved through plea deals and never go to trial. Besides, it's not like the police just all of a sudden figured out that lying can work out for them. They didn't just stumble upon this life hack. That term, test-a-lying, yeah, the police are the ones who named it that, way back in 1994, as revealed by a mayoral commission investigating police corruption. Quote, "Perjury is perhaps the most widespread form of police wrongdoing facing today's criminal justice system." So when we talk about the changes being proposed in consent decrees, like changing the rules of use of force or protocols around engaging with suspects, it kinda just doesn't matter. The police can just lie and say they did everything by the book and face zero pushback whatsoever. A consent decree isn't even really meant to change how the police function, just improve their PR.
What the goal of the consent decree is to minimize the visibility and the occurrence, but really like the visibility of the problem. Because you kind of, if you have effective internal investigations and you keep your records and you don't give the officers the idea that that's okay to commit brutality, then it shouldn't be such a big problem because you're punishing the officers who commit it, and maybe they keep their jobs and get back pay for the time that they've been suspended, but it's just unpleasant.
This is the reality of police reform, and I think that in some ways, We Own This City really captures the despair people feel when faced with these hard truths about the police.
We built this machine where half the damn country, the part with money and power, chew up the other half that didn't have anything to begin with.
Next. Vincent.
Watch it work.
Sean.
If this is what we want,
Resisting arrest.
then the Freddie Grays, the Eric Garners, the Michael Browns are what we get.
Not guilty.
And every page of whatever court order we write, it won't fix it.
So, like, what are we supposed to do? Back in September of 2022, David Simon, the prickly personality he is, got into it on Twitter with some police abolitionists who were calling The Wire conservative art. He fired off a long thread about how the war on drugs has corrupted the mission of policing, incentivizing stats over police work, driving mass incarceration, and how you can't abolish prisons and the police overnight, which again, I don't think any serious person is arguing for. If we're being honest about it, he was kind of a dick. But it echoes what Simon said in an interview with the New York Times for The Wire's 20th anniversary. All the discourse about abolish the police or defund the police. I'd be happy to defund the drug war. I'd be happy to change the mission, but I don't want to defund the police. Good police work is necessary and elemental, or my city becomes untenable. I've seen casework done right, and I've seen casework done wrong, and it matters. This, I think, is exactly what those Twitter abolitionists were calling conservative. That even for someone like David Simon, who can see all of the issues with the police and the barriers to change, he still just can't quit them as an idea. For the record, the idea of defunding the police is that we might be able to better prevent crime if we diverted money away from militarized police departments and used it to fund social programs. As the theory goes, people would commit less crime if they were less desperate, which makes a lot of sense to me. After all, we know that a number of sociological factors correlate really strongly with crime, and especially violent crime, like housing and food insecurity, residential segregation, mental health, employment, and so on and so forth. But it's not just in these comments. You can see Simon's resistance to siphoning money away from the police all over the show. While he's not sympathetic to Jenkins and his team at all, the show does portray them as poor working class.
Okay, Danny, might have to go in the old secret stash then.
Look at this shithole. The city doesn't pay us enough to fix this.
Yeah, crabs are expensive as fuck this year, man. That's all I could afford.
Looking to add to their meager paychecks with overtime and crime.
So my base last year was 85 and my overtime was 83. Yeah, you heard that right. I don't know if y'all are fucking math wizards, but I'll tell you right now, that's 1 in 70,000. That ain't fucking bad for a sergeant doing day work, right?
No.
That's exactly what the fuck we gonna do. We gonna keep up that good work. So starting tomorrow, we gonna work 8 to 4, but we ain't coming in till 2. Ooh.
Hey.
Yeah.
Shit.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah. But when we do come in, we come correct. We go proactive as a motherfucker, you understand me? We come to fucking hunt.
There's that conversation about how the consent decree will cost a lot of money, framed as if the mayor's babies aren't also programs that could help reduce crime.
Now you're telling me to cut pay from the guys who are working.
Your job is to keep crime down with the resources that are available. And with the money we're spending and the crime rate out of control in Baltimore, it will no longer be available.
No money for my babies. Fine cuts.
It's a vision that is decidedly pro-good police. For Simon, these aren't issues inherent to the police, but that can be traced back to the war on drugs. I don't think it's crazy to imagine this scene as David Simon himself reaching through our TV to talk to us directly.
What the hell is a war on drugs? What does that mean? Waging a war against citizens. By definition, it's separating us into two opposing camps.
The colonizer and the colonized.
Ah, Albert Memmi, very good, yes. And with the war comes police militarization, SWAT teams, tactical squads, stop and frisk, strip searches, a complete gutting of the Fourth Amendment. It was like we're fighting terrorists on foreign soil.
And I don't disagree. The war on drugs was bad and continues to be bad. It has led to mass incarceration that disproportionately targets Black and brown people, and the country remains awash in drug overdoses and deaths. Things would definitely be better if the war on drugs ended today, tomorrow, yesterday, immediately. But there's something kind of weird about that speech too. It's very nostalgic for a simpler time of policing in a way that kind of inadvertently undercuts Simon's point.
I came on in '72, walking foot up in the Northwest, and then plainclothes ops, after that narcotics, and I did my longest stint in homicide. After my retirement, I ended up back here at the academy teaching.
Sounds like a rewarding career.
It was. I loved being a cop. You know, I loved it when the job meant something, when you could make an arrest for a street robbery or a rapist or put down a murder. There was nothing finer.
Did you catch that? Policing was a lot better back in the day, before the war on drugs. Except that the war on drugs started in 1971. It's been waging for the entirety of that guy's career. There is no before. We're talking about a practice that is over 50 years old. Besides, it's not like policing in Baltimore was without its racial brutality issues before the war on drugs. In 1942, black soldier Thomas Brodus was assaulted by a white officer named Edward Bender. Later, a gubernatorial commission found that Brodus was fleeing when Bender shot and killed him. Bender was charged with murder, but the charges were dropped. Brodus was the second black person Bender had killed. The police killing black people, a story as old as America itself. Baltimore Police Commissioner, and I'm going to butcher his name and I don't care because he's a piece of shit, Donald Pomerleau, who served from 1966 all the way to 1982, created the Inspectional Services Division and used it to bring the city under heavy surveillance. As Rutgers Associate Professor of History Mary Rizzo notes, the ISD monitored, quote, the supposedly subversive activities of 125 different groups, from the American Civil Liberties Union to the Black Panther Party. Using wiretaps, photography, infiltration of groups, and telephone records, ISD officers were so excessive that one warned his relatives to never stop at a political rally out of curiosity, because they would be added to the division's extensive data gathering operation. Pomerleau would be accused of using this surveillance to bust unions, harass black-oriented and anti-Vietnam War organizations, and to intimidate journalists. Michael Olseker of the Baltimore Sun, where David Simon used to work, described meeting the police chief in the mid-1970s, quote, "Listen," he said, "I know where you've been, I know who you've talked to, and I know what you've been told." And he did. In other words, the police misconduct we see in We Own This City, warrantless searches and seizures.
I got Fourth Amendment violations, warrantless searches.
No goal of conviction.
Doesn't go to court, pulls them off the street till they see the court commissioner in the morning, then they drop the charges.
And targeted harassment.
Jenkins had this thing about anybody over like 18 carrying a book bag. You figured they were concealing drugs or weapons.
These existed independently of the war on drugs. So what policing is David Simon really nostalgic for? What halcyon period could he possibly remember? There's this final text at the end of the series, which implies a pretty strong correlation between the murder rate in Baltimore and the police slowdown following Freddie Gray's death. Simon loves to use homicide detectives as his example of good police. In both The Wire and We Own This City, he differentiates between the good police solving murders and the cops who police drugs.
I'm not a narco. I don't dirty people because I don't give a shit about a possession charge. I'm a murder police. I'm here about the bodies.
He separates homicide from the rest of the police and tries to argue that the war on drugs has tainted things. Murder police can always be used to bash activists. If you defund the police, what will you do about murders? And look, the statistics We Own This City cites are certainly accurate. There was an undeniable and near immediate explosion of crime in Baltimore following Freddie Gray's funeral. But I think that the way We Own This City presents this information is emblematic of a trap that we all too often fall into as Americans. That we have only ever known crime to be addressed by the police. We see the world as this big-ass knob where we can turn more police or less police, and those are the only two options. And sure, with all things being equal, police are a better option for fighting crime than sitting on our hands. But that's not what defund the police activists are arguing for. Besides, the police are designed to solve murders, not to prevent them. They come in after the crime has been committed. And even if they are better than the cops on the front lines of the war on drugs, they're still part of the same system. Fruits of a poisonous tree.
I don't talk to police. I'm homicide. It make no difference to me. Ain't nobody born homicide. Were you one of those jump out boys?
I did that for a while, yes.
And some of y'all rob people. Hell, I got robbed my damn self. Look, nothing personal, but I've been living in Baltimore all my life. I know.
Look, there are conflicting studies about how much police presence reduces crime. There's this study, often cited by conservatives and police defenders, that implies that, quote, adding a new police officer to a city prevents between 0.06 and 0.1 homicides. The U.S. Office of Justice Programs released this study in 1985 and found that, quote, an examination of the relationships between population, number of police per 1,000 population, crime rate, and crime rate ranking for 26 major cities fails to reveal consistent relationships among these variables. There is very little correlation between police department budget size and violent crime. Baltimore ranks first by a mile in police spending per capita, yet still holds one of the highest homicide rates in the country, over 8 times the national average, and has been above the average for a long time. In that same interview about The Wire's 20th anniversary, Simon's writing partner, Ed Burns, was a bit more amenable to the idea of defunding the police, saying, "Recently, the Biden administration and the New York mayor's administration said they want to increase the number of police on the street. It amuses me that what they're doing is a definition of insanity. You try something, it doesn't work. You try it again, it doesn't work. It's about time you try something different. They're still trying the same thing. Granted, defund the police is not the right way of presenting the argument, but rechanneling money away from the police to people who could better handle some of the aspects of it would be good. And then doing something even more dramatic, like creating an economic engine other than drugs to help people get up and start making something of their lives." This is going to shock you, but I am inclined to agree with Burns. I am not sure we can look at how the police have operated for their entire existence and credibly argue that we should pump more money in the form of consent decrees and reforms and hope that this time they'll fix themselves.
You're asking me what happens if the police don't want to change.
No, I'm saying that we are the people the police department hunts and kills and captures. And you are bringing me a piece of paper that says there's going to be new rules on how they can hunt us?
While We Own This City is certainly critical of Baltimore police officers, it's not critical of the police as a concept, as an institution. And by not challenging that framing, it ends up just reinforcing the status quo. Wayne Jenkins is a total piece of who should be so lucky as to. But the show tells us his inner life. We see the pressures on the department. We see the problems they're facing, the success Wayne is having.
Make sure we run the item on Jenkins and the gun trace task force. Make sure that's in the newsletter too. If I'm gonna sell the consent decree and change on the one hand, I've got to acknowledge the people who are putting guns and drugs on the table now.
The message is clear. This is a hard job. We need better people and more money. The more we focus on the police, the more our stories center them and their perspectives, the more we are going to sympathize with them, to see the world they do, where they are the only way to fight or reduce crime, even in cases where those stories aren't necessarily sympathetic to them. Don't go making the police sound too relatable, hating paperwork, because, like, I hate paperwork.
The funny thing is, like, after doing that book, I could really relate to police. It was bizarre. And that's what happens. Like, once you really get familiar with what it's like to be a police officer, even black people that go into office as like a prosecutor or a like public defender or a judge I've heard this term, the undercover brother, that they're gonna like be hard on the cops. They always end up sympathizing with the cops.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of a phenomenon. And I think it's because like it's a complicated issue. You know, it's not just like, oh, the police are terrible and racist and like incompetent, you know, like all those things are true, but they're also like the main thing we have.
We Own This City still locks us into that police knob, asking us more police who suck or rampant rioting. That's just a false dichotomy, and one we should be cognizant of in even the most progressive of cop shows. In 2015, in the wake of Freddie Gray's death, writer Dave Zirin realized that there was something missing from The Wire, actually. Black activists and community leaders trying to lift up their community. Quote, "Why were those fighting for a better Baltimore invisible to David Simon? I don't mean those fighting on behalf of Baltimore, the often white teachers, the social workers, and the good-natured cops who were at the heart of The Wire, but those fighting for their own liberation. Why was The Wire big on failed saviors and short on those trying to save themselves? And if these forces were invisible to David Simon, shouldn't we dial down the praise of the show as this great American novel of television and instead see it for what it is? Just a cop show." In the end, We Own the City argues the same way the police do. As Dr. Tamara Nopper told the New York Times, quote, "If crime is low, the police are doing their jobs. If crime is high, we need to give more money to the police. The police always win."
This game is rigged, man. We like them little bitches on the chessboard.
Pawns. But what about good police work, you might be asking yourself, somehow, after all of this? Police reformists like David Simon will often point to things like Operation Ceasefire in Boston, which was a 1996 program that was very successful in reducing violent crime, leading to a 63% monthly drop in youth homicides in the city. how do they do that? As Rod Brunson describes it in the Washington Post, quote, "It devoted increased law enforcement attention and a wide range of social services to a number of high-risk offenders who were deemed responsible for a disproportionate amount of violent crime. Focused deterrence models enjoy an advantage over more divisive crime reduction strategies, stop and frisk or broken windows, because rather than casting a wide net of criminal suspicion over entire black neighborhoods, they rely on data to identify high-risk individuals and groups for intervention and customized social services." But the dirty secret about Operation Ceasefire is that you don't need the police to do all of it. Customized social services and intervention, that's kind of what defund the police activists are advocating for. We Own This City depicts a ton of legitimate problems with the Baltimore Police Department and the hard challenges reformist policies face. But in the end, David Simon and his show can't find it in themselves to find fault with the institution of policing, instead focusing all of their ire towards the war on drugs.
The drug war.
Exactly. And in a war, you need warriors. In a war, you have enemies. In a war, civilians get hurt and nobody does anything. In a war, you count the bodies and then you call them victories. Is the Justice Department or even the Office of Civil Rights ready to declare that we long ago lost this war?
As Stuart Schrader wrote in his review of the series for Boston Review, quote, "Simon would have us believe that cracking down on drugs is the main thing police do nowadays. And if only they left that goal behind, policing would become more just, and police would be more accountable to Black Baltimore. It seems like Simon needs the war on drugs more than the cops do. It is his master explanation of what is wrong with policing. Even though it was not the GTTF's primary campaign, the police have shown us time and again that they don't want to change. They are doing exactly the job they were given."
Half the department has quit working to protest the Freddie Gray indictments, and the other half can't stop beating on people. And both halves tell me the job can't be done legally. If the job requires some of the things that I've already seen and already heard, then I think it is fair to question what these people think the job is.
She's out here dishing out fucking charges to these police officers for doing their job.
That's all they doing.
That's all they did. They did their fucking job.
What the fuck else? We're doing our jobs. What do people want? For us to stop policing?
For what?
Hey, easy. Let the man do his job. Because if you want to do this job, then you're going to get complaints for doing this job.
We were the ones who got the guns, who brought the drugs. We were the cops they wanted.
In 2020, a number of cities said that they'd think about defunding the police, and some even promised to. But then, a violent crime wave shook the United States! Or at least that's what you'd think from listening to many news outlets and politicians. In actuality, the violent crime rate across the country has been very steady and is still about an 80% reduction from where it was in the 90s. I'd love to tell you that this happened in both cities that defunded the police and those that didn't. But nobody defunded the police. ABC examined 109 police budgets nationwide and saw that 91 of them had increased police funding by at least 2%. And in 49 cities or counties, police funding had increased by more than 10%. That's the way police reform usually goes. There are activists and community workers ready to try other ideas, even if you wouldn't know it from the way cop shows like We Own This City limit the scope of the conversation. I liked We Own This City, and I loved The Wire, but they both still reinforce the idea that the police are the main way to address crime, rather than a limited tool that should be used in concert with social programs to improve the material conditions of people in a way that could reduce crime. I guess what I'm trying to say is that as sexy as consent decrees are, and boy oh boy do they soak my socks, maybe we shouldn't funnel money into the same system that has continually failed us. How about we get really sexy and start imagining other ways to help people? Look, I don't know about you, but all this talk about consent decrees and funding social programs has me positively hot and bothered. I can't help it. I don't know what to do with myself. Whew. And here's the problem. Every time I try to take care of this myself, I get oh so close. And then I start thinking about how much people vote for Law and Order when they get scared, and then I get scared and also soft. Luckily, I don't have to wait for massive sweeping socioeconomic change to take care of this. I just need adamandeve.com and my handy dandy code intro. That's right, we don't even have time to use my full government name this time. Adam and Eve offers discreet shipping, so nobody else needs to know how much the current state of policing has me down, and a 90-day no-hassle return policy, just in case. Plus, Adam and Eve gives 20% of their profits to fight HIV, and if that's not one last way to stick it to the father of mass incarceration, Ronald Reagan, then I don't know what is. Again, that's adamandeve.com with the code INTRO to get 50% off an item and free shipping in the US and Canada. And if you'd like to help me continue this series on propaganda, or to watch my full interview with Tim Tolka, or to get early access for future videos, consider supporting the channel on Patreon. I do a lot of research for these videos, and taking that kind of time to talk about topics like this, it's kind of only possible because of the support I get there from my beautiful patrons. There they go, scrolling by. If you'd like to get your name in the credits, to actually get your follow-up questions in the comments answered, head over there and throw in something, anything. And if you can't, that's totally fine too. Just don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, or I'll find you. Talk at you again next time.